Hello students. So the paper we are handling in this discussion is VAHO1002101. But we are doing more than just handling a paper. We are actually going to be giving you an introduction to verbal ability. Now what exactly is this thing that we call verbal ability? Well, if you look at the exam itself, you realize that the exam has RCs and it has paragraph type questions. So the general tendency is to refer to the non-RC questions. That means the questions which are not exactly RC. We tend to call them verbal ability. But let's just remember that verbal ability is a complete ability. It's an ability with language. In this case, of course, we're looking at English. But in any language, your verbal ability is your ability to use that language. So here also, we're looking at the business of using the language entirely, not just the verbal ability questions, or what we call the verbal ability questions, which means the ones which are not RC. We're not focusing only on those. We're focusing on the entire set of skills that constitute verbal ability. And we're going to use this paper to support our overview of that. So this particular discussion is almost like an overview of what we mean by general verbal ability and what it is that we can do to be able to improve in that area. So let's start with the cat itself, for instance. Why is there so much hype or anxiety? Hoopla actually means a lot of anxiety, and everybody keeps talking about it in very anxious ways. Why is there so much hoopla about the cat RC? And people say that's because there are choices that we have to make, and the choices are so difficult to make. Sometimes you have questions where the choices are really tough and you're not able to figure out which choice to make. So why is it that we have a difficulty in making a choice? Now if you look at this cartoon here of this person who's gone to a baker and is asking for bread, and the baker asks him, so what do you want? Do you want white or do you want wheat? And this guy is throwing his hands up because he doesn't know. He doesn't know what he wants. Why does he not know what he wants? Well, either somebody didn't tell him what the difference between the two is. What is the difference between white and wheat? Why would you want white or why would you want wheat? For what reasons and for what nutritional, let's say, inputs? Or even if someone didn't tell him, he did not try to find out for himself. So now when he's faced with a choice, he's not able to make a choice and he finds it very bothersome. But essentially he's not able to make a choice because he does not know the difference. And that is exactly the reason that in the cat, people find it difficult to make a choice because they don't know the difference between choices. But why wouldn't they know? Because they haven't actually understood what they're dealing with. So what should the approach be? Should you just say, okay, I know some things and some things I don't know. So like the ostrich, I'll stick my head in the sand and I'll hope that the unknown things don't turn up. And if they do turn up, I'll just allow them to pass me by and I hope that things will be okay thereafter. Can you just hope for the best, knowing fully well that you don't know some things? You can't do that because you never know how much you're going to get in terms of the stuff that you know and the stuff you don't know. So you don't know what proportions it's going to come in. For all you know, everything that you know might come. Or for all you know, nothing that you know might come. So you cannot actually just hope for the best. You cannot even in some sense depend on somebody else to bail you out, like God. Do what you can do. That means just the minimum that maybe your head can take in. Then pray to God and He'll do the rest. That's not going to happen either. You know that. I mean, the old adage really is that God helps those who help themselves. So if there is God, you need to do work for Him to help you, or for her to help you. So the point is that you cannot just kind of leave it to things. You can't just hope against hope. You can't just say, I'll do whatever I can and I hope that God will help me with the rest. You can't do that. What do you have to do then? Well, you've got to prepare. You've got to prepare in a manner where you know things, you're clear about things, and therefore you can make the difference between choices. You can recognize the distinction between choices. So you need to get cracking. And to get cracking would mean that you start looking at improving your skills straight away. So that's what this verbal ability is about. It's about what are the skills that go into verbal ability, what is it that you can do to improve on it, and what is it that we give you by way of practice to actually help you do it. Okay. So to begin with, to understand what these skills are and why we need them, let's have a look at the composition of the cat itself, the verbal segment. Well, if you look at last year's cat 2021, the cat verbal segment had 24 questions in all, of which 16 were RC and 8 were what we call verbal ability, which means they were non-RC questions. And of these 24 questions, a total of 5 were what we call non-MCQ questions. That means they did not have choices, they had boxes and you were supposed to put in the answer. So type in the answer questions, where you're not given choices but you're given a box. And that means you have to arrive at the answer yourself, and it has to be the perfect answer. So this 24 questions last year was virtually a smaller, let's say, number than we saw the previous year when we had 26, and the year before that when we had 34. But of course, I think all of you realize why the numbers have come down. That's basically because thanks to the pandemic, the whole business of the exam at centers has actually been suspended for the last 2 years. And therefore the time constraint and the whole business of the exam in large numbers, right? Not at centers. There were centers, of course, but because of the constraint in terms of what should we say, social distancing, in terms of ensuring that people didn't gather in crowds, the passages, rather the periods of the exam were reduced, and the time that people had to spend on campuses were reduced, and therefore the segments themselves were made smaller. Now, is it likely to remain this way? You can't tell. I mean, clearly, if eventually people do kind of start coping in the pandemic and we get back to, let's say, something the way it was earlier, then we might actually go back to more questions. So why am I talking about this multiplicity of questions? Because really it doesn't matter. For you, the key is preparation. And if you prepare well, then whether you have 24 questions or 26 or 34 or even more than that maybe, you will still be prepared. So I'm only giving you the number of questions to give you an indication of what it was like, but that doesn't mean that the number of questions determines exactly how prepared you must be. You have to be prepared anyway. Now let's look at the areas that they had. So when it came to comprehension, there were 4 passages, each with 4 questions. And they're the kind of stuff that you would have read in magazines, okay, in newspapers, in journals. They're not exactly specialty areas. Mayan civilization, utopia and dystopia, marshmallow experiment, so somebody actually talked about some psychology experiment there, or the evolution of tea, which means how that tea drinking habit even came about. So you might say, but sir, these are not things that we read on an everyday basis. No, you don't read them on an everyday basis, but people write about them. People write about them in journals and in magazines and in newspapers, especially in the supplements, and certainly on the net. So you realize that a person who has a decent reading habit is likely to have come across topics like these, if not the same ones, certainly topics like these. And for such a person, it would not be terribly difficult to understand them. Correct? Now the difficulty levels we have here, I've taken this piece of detail from our website where we review the exams, right? The content here is about the morning slot of that particular day, the exam day. So the difficulty levels were put down as difficult and difficult for 2 passages, and very difficult for 1 passage, and moderate for another passage. Now, when you say difficult and very difficult and moderate, you realize that you're actually relating this to the preparedness of a candidate. If a candidate is really well prepared, things are not going to be very difficult. If your preparation is really top class, most things will actually be moderate to difficult, that's about it. But it's not going to be very difficult. The very difficult is because you're not ready. You haven't read that kind of stuff before, or you're unfamiliar with the way people run those thoughts. So if you have a good reading habit, then this difficulty level is not going to be the way it is in the column here. It will be certainly less. Then if you look at the verbal ability, there were what we call para formation questions, which is the para jumble, and there were 3 of these para jumbles. And our analysts have said that the level was moderate. And then there were odd one out statements where you have 5 statements, 4 of which make a paragraph and 1 statement doesn't fit in the paragraph, and you have to identify which one that is. Well, those were considered difficult. And then you had para summaries where you're given a paragraph and you have to pick a summary, and those 3 questions were considered moderate. Now, so if everything is about the level of preparation that people engage in, then why would we call something very difficult or difficult? Because we've given this review on the basis of the person who's reasonably well prepared. Reasonably. But you realize that your preparedness has to be beyond reasonably well prepared. You have to prepare really, really well. So let's have a look at what we can do to prepare. So since the whole exam is actually about reading, you realize you have RC right up there, which is about reading. But then you have to order a paragraph. And how do you do that? Because on reading it, you recognize what the content is, what the purpose is, and therefore what the sequence must be. Which means there's reading right there. And the odd one out. When on reading them, you realize that 4 of them relate to a particular topic and 1 doesn't. So there's reading there. Para summaries. Writing a summary is actually proof of good reading. When you read well and you understand what you're dealing with and you're able to distinguish between main ideas and smaller ideas, then you can actually write a good summary. So you realize one way or the other, whether we call them RC questions or we call them verbal ability questions, the whole thing is about reading. So this verbal ability we're talking about here is being tested in your reading. Now let's remember, verbal ability could also be in the way you speak, in the clarity with which you listen, in the ability that you have to write. But in this exam, it's basically about your capability in reading. How effectively do you read? So how good is your verbal ability when demonstrated through reading? And that could happen through RCs, passages with questions that follow each passage. It could also happen with general verbal ability questions, which is paragraphs that you have to read and understand. So since reading is the entirety, since reading is exactly what the whole thing is about, let's just look at this. If I were to understand what authors do, then I would actually be a little more confident about my reading. So if we know what authors do, then we are clear about what we should do when we read. So what do authors do? Let's have a look at that. So if I were to put down, let's say, a rectangle to represent a piece of writing that an author turns out, what is it that the author wants to give the reader here? Well, the author wants to give the reader, that means by the time the reader finishes, the author would like the reader to receive some sort of totality. Let's call it a total picture. That means the author would like the reader to get a total picture, a complete impression of what the author is trying to say. I call it a total picture, but what I mean is there is a totality in terms of a theme or a central issue that the writer really wants the reader to know about. But this total picture, what is it composed of? Well, it's actually composed of ideas. And the ideas are not scattered at random, like stars in the sky. The ideas are actually in order. There are main ideas, some really big fellows, and there are ancillary ideas, quite a few of them. But all together, the main ideas and the ancillaries, they all add up. And they all add up to this total picture. Okay? But the fact is, they are also in some sort of flow. They are also organized in some fashion. So the ideas, whether they are ancillary ideas or their main ideas, all of them work together in a certain flow to give you this total picture. But what do writers do to ensure that you understand an idea well? If they think that the idea is somewhat unfamiliar to you, that means you haven't actually come across it before, then what would they do with that? Well, what they would do is they'd give you something that you can relate to. They'd give you some support elements. Now, what can these support elements be? Well, the most obvious one would be the example, because this is something that you're already familiar with, something that you've seen otherwise, and the person uses this to say, see, this is an example of the idea I'm giving you. So that means you can relate to it and understand the idea. So yes, you get examples. You also get information or data or statistics, etc. I'll put that down as information, because information by itself is not idea, it's the basis for an idea. So information supports an idea by providing you the elements that, let's say, provide evidence of the idea. Okay, so you get information. You would also get references sometimes. References of two kinds. You have references which are, let's say, we call them analogies, where a person, so that's A-N-A-L-O-G-Y, but I'm just putting analogy. So you get analogies which are basically parallels drawn from other areas that you're familiar with. For instance, if I were to give you, while talking about economics, if I were to give you a parallel from, let's say, biology, well, that would be an analogy. Something that depicts a similar sort of pattern of thought in this particular topic as well. So that's an analogy. But I could also, and do remember, analogy is A-N-A-L-O-G-Y. Okay, so the word there is analogy. So you could get analogies, but you could also get allusions. Now, what are allusions? So I'll put it as ALS. What are allusions? Let me put that word as well. A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N. So what is an allusion? An allusion is a reference to common human experience. Something in human experience, okay? Something in history, something in literature, something in mythology, something in, let's say, culture, etc. These things are what we call allusions. And they are references that help you relate to ideas that the author has presented. So they are also support elements. Sometimes an author might quote somebody else. Why would they quote someone else? Because they're telling you, listen, I'm small fry. You might not quite have picked up what I said because you haven't heard of me before. But if I told you that somebody that you knew had actually made such statements and had talked about such ideas, then would you understand mine? And that is it. Why would I, if I was writing about non-violence, why would I quote Gandhiji? Because all of you are familiar with what it is that he said, and therefore that supports what I said. So with quotations, what writers are doing is they're falling back on somebody else to support what you're saying. So people do things like this. They use all these support elements. And why do they use these support elements? Well, one way or the other, these support elements support ideas. They might support individual ideas, they might support combinations of ideas, they might support the totality. But that's why they use them. Now, the other thing we must remember is that this flow we talked about, this flow is basically an organized pattern. That means how the ideas are organized. So the organization, okay, is actually something that indicates to you the purpose. The organization of the piece actually indicates to you purpose. Now you'd say, how is that? Well, I organize things in a certain manner if I'm explaining them. I organize them slightly differently if I am offering an answer to a question or a solution to a problem. I organize them slightly differently if I'm analyzing an issue, if I'm looking at pros and cons. So the manner in which people lay down the ideas, that means the flow that they adopt from one idea to the next, in some sense that pattern indicates to you what the author's purpose is. So the organization indicates purpose, and you do know that this is what we call a writing style. Okay? So people adopt slightly different styles of writing depending on what their purpose is. And when you pay attention to the flow, you understand that. And then you realize an author also allows you into his or her head. They allow you to recognize how they feel about something, what their attitude is towards something that they're writing about. So this business about attitude or emotional involvement or feeling towards what the person is writing about, how do you get this? So you get attitude from the language people use, from the nature of the language used. Correct? So the positive, negative nature of language use, the sarcasm, the cheerfulness, the anger, the depression, you get this from language. You pay attention to the words, the phrases, and you get to understand this is the way the author feels. We call that tone. We call that the author's tone, okay? The tone of their language. Namely, you pay attention to what the author, what the language depicts in terms of emotional content or emotional involvement. And then let's also remember that wherever it is that authors have opinions, opinions are worthless unless they are backed by reason. So there must be basis for an opinion. And so when people do give you opinions, they are going to give you some amount of reason. Of course, may not be all, but you know that there is some reason provided, and you can probably work out what the rest is. But yes, the author does also, especially when you're looking at opinion-based writing, there is also reasoning. So this is what writers do. Writers have ideas, they put those, and those ideas could be smaller ideas and main ideas. They put them together into a certain flow to deliver to you a total picture. They support this entire set of expressions with examples and information and references and quotations and so on, all of which are not ideas themselves, but they support the ideas that you get. And they present the ideas in a particular flow which is indicative of the purpose. They also present in a certain language which is indicative of their own attitude or emotional involvement. And they present you reasons for any opinions, at least some reasons for the opinions that they have. Now this is what writers do. And if I am to read effectively, whether it is in terms of RC or whether it is in terms of the non-RC type questions, I need to read effectively. And my effective reading has to span all of this. Since this is what writers do, then this is what I should do when I read. This is what I should pick up when I read. So how do I pick up these things? Well, I use certain tools. What tools? The same tools that the writer uses. Well, what tools does the writer use? The writer uses vocabulary, because the vocabulary or the words or the phrases enable them to represent their thoughts. But then the words or phrases don't work on their own. They're put together in certain complete expressions which actually make sense. Therefore, there is sentence structure, or what we call grammar. So the author uses sentence structure to be able to put thoughts together into meaningful ideas. So there's grammar. But then there's a plan also. It's not just each sentence looked at individually. The person puts into the sentences something that helps him connect to subsequent sentences, that helps him open up an idea of discussion. And then there is a connection between sentences themselves, which is what we call a flow. So how does the person get that? Because he plans it. The author puts some thinking process into the writing so that it goes according to a certain plan. So the author does use a thought process as well. So he uses vocabulary, she also, let's not say only he. So authors use vocabulary, they use sentence structure or grammar, and they use a thought process to plan what they are writing. And if this is what they use, then this is exactly what we need. We as readers also need vocabulary, we need recognition of grammar, and we need to have our thought processes alert while we read so that we can pick up the plan that the author has. So for us, verbal ability is the ability to recognize the use of vocabulary when we are reading. Recognize the use of vocabulary, recognize the use of particular sentence structure, recognize the thought processes that go behind the piece of writing, and recognize the reasoning that actually backs a person's opinions. So there are 4 areas that we would really want to pay attention to. But do remember, these are not independent areas. They all work together. So we would call the skill one large set of skills. We call it reading, the skill. And therefore, in reading, we are combining our separate verbal skills. But they are not separate. It's just that we consider them separately, but we actually put them together. So we say we learn vocabulary because we know the meanings of words. We say we learn grammar when we know how sentences are structured. We say we pay attention to thought processes when we actually pay attention to paragraphs, etc. We say we pay attention to reasoning when we're looking at reasoning-based questions. But the fact is, all of them work together in good reading. So your reading is where these skills are going to be built. Your reading is where these skills are going to be practiced. And while we will look at these skills separately in terms of what can be done to build them, let's remember that in the final analysis, you build them basically out of your reading and you use them in your reading. So reading is everything. You need to make reading a regular habit. Something that you engage in every day. Something, give yourself some variety in. So that you pick up new vocabulary, so that you recognize sentence structure, so that you can work out thought processes, and so that you can work out reasoning behind people's opinions. So let's remember that when I say get cracking over here, the significant part of that preparation is actually going to be in your reading. The more you read, the better you get. The more you read, the better your skills become. The more skills you have, the better your reading is. So it's like a cycle. The more skills, better reading. Better reading, more skills. So in this paper that we have here, this VAHO1002101, we are looking at what these skills are and how does your study material help you build these skills. But let's also remember that you use your study material to supplement your reading habit. The more reading you do, then these practice exercises in your study material actually help you recognize your development and your, let's say, expansion of your general verbal abilities. Okay? So that means this paper is going to have some vocab type questions, some grammar type questions, some questions that actually demonstrate thought process, some questions that look at reasoning. But just to let you know that these are the skills that you need, these are the skills that your study material is hoping to help you achieve. But you'll achieve it because you pay attention to these things when you read. Alright, so let's get down to that. So let's look at some of the vocab questions. So why are we looking at synonyms? Now synonyms of course are things that are similar in meaning to other words, because especially when it comes to reading comprehension, when people give us choices that depict ideas that we've read in the passage, they may not give the choices in the very same words. They might present them in slightly different ways, which means they might actually, and in those different ways, they could use synonyms. So if I don't know synonyms, if I don't recognize them, then I perhaps could miss out on the meaning of what people are trying to tell me. So it's good for me to have synonyms, right? It's good for me to know words that work the way other words do. So what is the meaning of bucolic? Well, bucolic is a word that actually relates to, let's say, the impression that you get in the countryside. Something that is to do with the countryside, open spaces, agriculture, rural areas, gentle woods, stuff like that. So bucolic is that. So if bucolic is to do with the countryside, then obviously a synonym here would be rustic, because bucolic and rustic both mean to do with the countryside. So bucolic is more in the nature of impression that people get of what they're dealing with, and rustic can be used to provide an adjective for the countryside, can also be used to provide for people from the countryside or the mannerisms that people have, but both are to do with the countryside. So bucolic and rustic. What is urbane? Urbane is cultured, sophisticated, right? That is urbane. When is something contagious? Well, it's contagious when it transmits itself very easily. When something moves from one person to another very easily, like an illness for instance, or like a smile, that's contagious. Cultivated. Well, it could be the past tense of cultivate, which is to actually develop something almost in agriculture or even otherwise. You can cultivate a habit. And something cultivated is when something has become a habit, right? So that's cultivated. So bucolic and rustic would be your synonyms here. So now you know why it's good to know synonyms, because you need to recognize ideas even if people use different words. Then you also have these things that we call foreign terms. So foreign terms are also something that you need as part of your vocabulary for a very simple reason. The English language actually uses a lot of foreign terms. The English of course spread themselves all over the world. In some places they were good, in some places they were a nuisance, but they spread themselves all over. And they actually picked up a lot of words from other people's languages because they found them effective. They found them useful. They found that they deliver a certain punch that their own translations did not. So they use these terms. So they use a lot of terms from other languages, and as a reader, I would need to know those terms, or at least I need to come across them. Because if I see a foreign term that I have no idea about, then that's almost as good as not knowing what the person is saying. So yes, we need foreign terms. So as we read and pick up vocabulary, we also pay attention to foreign terms. Now look at the word here, laissez-faire, which is a very common word used in English. It is actually a French word. It means let them do. But they use it in English, especially when we talk about economic policy, etc., or we talk about educational policy. We use the term laissez-faire to mean that we will leave it to people to organize their own affairs. We will not interfere in what they do. That means it is actually a policy of least regulation. That means regulate only when necessary, otherwise let people develop themselves. That is exactly what laissez-faire is. So the answer to laissez-faire would be A, which is a policy of non-interference in the affairs of others, meaning we will step in and regulate only when it is absolutely necessary, but otherwise we would prefer that people work out things for themselves. So that is laissez-faire. Okay. What is the word cloistered? Well, the word cloistered actually means when a group isolates themselves from the rest of society for a particular period of time, then they are cloistered. Or somebody might grow up in a very cloistered environment, which means that they typically all their interactions are within a certain small community and they don't really have much exposure to the world outside of that. So that would be cloistered. Okay. Now you might say, if A is about having minimum regulatory control, why aren't we looking at D? If laissez-faire is about not having regulation, why aren't we looking at D? No, it goes beyond that. It is about let us not regulate because we need to allow other people to work on their own. So so the lack of regulation is more because you don't want to interfere, and therefore laissez-faire, which means let them do, is used in English to mean a policy of non-interference in others' affairs. So A would be your answer here. What about 3? Here we are looking at a word that is metaphoric, right? So we are looking at words that could be metaphoric. Metaphoric would mean that the literal translation of the word is not exactly what we're looking at, but we use it to deliver a similar kind of idea. So since the rejection of so here of course we have to identify the meaning of the word. So since the rejection of the European Constitutional Treaty by the Dutch and the French voters in 2005, the European Union has remained gridlocked. Now gridlocked, you know what a grid is. Well, a grid is like this, so you have a whole matrix, and that's a grid. But if you say gridlocked, you're saying that things are within the squares and are unable to move outside the squares. That is when things are gridlocked. So locked in a grid is gridlocked. In other words, we know that the word is being used as a metaphor to mean that people aren't able to move forward. People aren't able to move. They're stuck in whatever situation they are in. So if you talk about the fact that they're stuck wherever they are and they're not able to move, then it's not just shell-shocked. Shell-shocked would mean extremely surprised, alarm, taken by surprise or alarm. Blocked is when your progress is stopped, not that you're jammed from all sides. Gridlocked is you're enclosed from all sides, isn't it? I told you grid, and then you place somebody within one of the squares in the grid, then they are enclosed on all sides. So it's not just blocked. Blocked is here. You're looking at progression, and it's supposed to progress this way, and then you have an obstacle right here. Now that would be blocked, right? Shell-shocked would be totally surprised or alarmed. Baffled would mean confused, not knowing which way to go. But we're talking about actually being constrained, actually being limited by boundaries, actually being put into a situation where you're stuck and you cannot move anyway. And therefore the word you want to straitjacketed. Now that is metaphoric as well, actually. Straitjacketed, well, a straitjacket. Okay, so we're going back to let's say medieval times, and in fact up to almost the late 18th century. A straitjacket is a jacket. Okay, so it's a jacket that somebody has to wear, and okay, that's the jacket. But the fact is it had very, very long sleeves. So this jacket had very long sleeves. So what are the purpose of these very long sleeves? So basically, when people were, let's say, insane or troubled, mentally troubled, and they tended to be violent, then people would put them in a jacket like this and then use those sleeves like restraints. They would wrap those sleeves around the person's body and keep them in it, because that way they could not harm themselves and they could not harm other people either. In other words, they could only walk around, but they could do nothing else. So a straitjacket was this kind of treatment, let's say, for a person who was tending to violence because they were somewhat, let us say, I hesitate to use the word insane, let's say mentally disturbed. So mentally disturbed people who are tending to violence, this was the way that they would put them into a jacket which had very long sleeves, and those sleeves would be tied around them. So that means the jacket put them in straits. Straits are constraints. So straitjacket, it is that. But now, fortunately, people don't use that particular jacket anymore. You'll find it in museums, and hopefully they're not using it anywhere else in the world. But we now use the term to mean completely restrained, completely contained within a space and unable to move. So that's what straitjacketed would mean. And therefore gridlocked and straitjacketed would be the same thing. I told you shell-shocked means totally alarmed or totally surprised. Blocked would mean obstructed, and baffled would mean confused. Now let's look at the fourth one. The fourth one is what we call a reverse dictionary. Something that, do I know a word that fits this phrase? Again, a very useful thing for reading comprehension. Because in reading comprehension, if you do know that a particular entire idea is represented in a few words in a choice, then you actually recognize what you're dealing with. So it's good to know words that actually fit certain phrases. So what's a word for using a few words, especially to the point of seeming casual or unfriendly, which means you don't talk very much, you just have monosyllabic answers or very short answers, and it seems almost rude. Okay, using a few words, especially to the point of seeming casual or rude. Well, the word there is laconic. Okay, so laconic is where people use minimal words. You know, they just say yes, no, or maybe, or just 2 or 3 words in an answer, which is almost like, listen, I don't want to talk, why are you bothering me? But it may not be. It may just be a person's way of using language. But that is what the word is. Laconic would mean using just a few words, even to the point of being rude. Succinct is when you're very, very brief in what you're saying. You're clear, but you're brief. That is succinct. Voluble is actually when you speak a great deal. When you talk a great deal. Prolix is also when you talk a great deal, when you have lots and lots of words. Okay, that is prolix. So the word we're looking at is laconic. Now you might ask, how did you actually arrive at that word? Well, if you were to consider the story of ancient Greece, we know that ancient Greece had different city-states, one of which was Sparta. Sparta was this place which was really, really simple, right? And Laconia, supposedly, so the story goes, Laconia was a particular locality or a district, let's say, in this particular city-state. And it was populated with people, the small population it had was basically people who were very, very quiet. That means they did not talk to strangers. When strangers did approach them, they would simply answer them in 1 or 2 words, and that's about it, and send them on their way. And therefore, it would seem like they were unfriendly or rude. And since this was the, let's say, the characteristic of people from Laconia, the word laconic is referring to that. So we've forgotten Laconia as a historical area, and we've forgotten the stories, but the fact is laconic means using just a few words to the point of seeing, to the point of being, almost to the point of being rude. Okay, so that is laconic. Then antonyms. Well, for the very same reason that it helps to know synonyms, especially to tackle choices in RCs, it helps to know antonyms also, especially when the questions are in the nature of which of the following except, so to be able to rule out things, it's good to know that a word here is opposite what the passage actually says. So it's good to know antonyms. So to precipitate, well, we know as a noun, precipitate is the substance that collects at the bottom of a container, right? So if you have a solution and not all of it is soluble, then you stir it, then the non-soluble parts are going to settle down at the bottom, and that's precipitate. But it also means as a verb to fall to the bottom. So when something falls to the bottom, it precipitates, right? But you can also precipitate let's say, you can also precipitate alarm. You can precipitate a confused state. When you cause it to happen, and you cause it to happen suddenly. So when something precipitates, it is caused to happen, right? It is caused to happen. That means, and it's caused to happen speedily. So that is to precipitate. So to precipitate a crisis is to bring about a crisis really fast. But why do we use the precipitate? Because obviously levels of something are dropping, and they're dropping fast. So you precipitate a crisis. That means the positives drop so fast that you actually have a crisis. So if precipitate means to drop really fast. Now, are we looking at precipitate in terms of allow things to accumulate? If we are, then we don't have an opposite. We don't have an opposite here to allow things to accumulate, because to condense is to actually come down to the bottom, right? I mean, to become thick. To coagulate is actually to become thick. To defray is actually to spread the risk of something. To spread the risk of something. To actually see that it's met by taking on burden, by different people taking on burdens. So we are not looking at the opposite of precipitate as in to come together. We are obviously looking at the opposite of precipitate, where precipitate means for something to happen rapidly. And if it's happening rapidly, then the only word we want is to slow it down. So to slow down things is to retard them. So when you retard something, you slow it down. Okay, like when you slow down the revolutions in an engine, you retard it. So retard is slowed down, or to slow down, and that would be the opposite of precipitate. We looked at condense, where things become dense. We looked at coagulate, where something liquid starts to solidify, and we looked at defray, where the impact of something is spread. Okay, right. Now let's move on. in 6 we have words, 2 of which are opposites, and our job is to find out which of these 2 are opposites. Now what does the word agnostic mean? Agnostic means not knowing, where a person does not know what to believe, or a person is in a state of doubt, or a person says I don't know, then that person is being agnostic. Pliant. A pliant person is someone who's quite willing to listen to other people, who's quite willing to be molded by other people, who's quite willing to do other people's bidding, is pliant. Callow is inexperienced. Callow is inexperienced because they're actually looking at a person who is not with much experience, does not know very much. So normally we use the word callow youth. Okay. Obstinate is stubborn. So a person who will not bend to other people's will. So we know that the opposites here must be pliant, a person who will bend to other people's will, and the opposite would be obstinate because we're looking at stubborn, or person who will not bend to other people's will. So the opposites we have are here in B and D, and therefore the answer is D. Agnostic, one who does not know or one who doubts. Callow, one who has no experience. When I say one, I mean it's an adjective for such a person. Pliant, a person is an adjective for a person who will actually do other people's biddings or a bidding, and obstinate is an adjective for a person who is stubborn and will not do what other people ask. So pliant and obstinate would be your opposites. So choice here would be D. Moving on, you have an idiom. So idioms are like any other vocabulary, like terms that people use to deliver certain meanings. The literal translation of the term doesn't translate to the meaning, but it's a traditional term that people have used with some cultural background perhaps, or with some everyday routine kind of background, that it's just adopted a certain meaning. That's about it. So we learn it as it is, very much the way we learn words and their meanings. So nobody is going to help you. You have to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, which means you're not going to get help from someone. You have to help yourself. You have to help yourself. Pull yourself up by the bootstrap. So if it's about you have to help yourself, then it has to be you have to help yourself improve by putting in effort yourself. So B would be the answer there. It's not only about overcoming all hurdles. It's about trying to overcome hurdles by working on your own. It's not about persisting. Continue to do something in spite of difficulties is persistence. We're not talking about persistence. We're talking about putting in effort on your own. It's not about bouncing back after every failure. The word for that would be resilience. It's not that. It is just that don't expect others to help you. You have got to help yourself. So improve your position by your own efforts. Okay, so B would be the answer to 7. What about 8? Well, 8, you need to pay attention to the what shall we say, the directions here. 4 sentences are given with a blank in each. 4 words are also given. The blank in each sentence can be filled by one or more of the 4 words given. Similarly, each word given in the choices can go into any number of sentences. So you can, one way of looking at it is that you can fill a blank in a sentence by more than one word. I mean, more than one word could work in that blank. I mean, separately, of course, they provide the same context. Or one word can go into more than one sentence. So identify the number of sentences a word can go into. So that means we have one possibility here and we have one possibility here, and what we are being asked to do is to actually run with the second possibility. Okay, so identify the number of sentences each word can go into and mark as your answer the maximum number of sentences that any word can go into. Right? Mark as your answer whether a word can go in once or twice or thrice or 4 times. Please remember that. So A would mean that the maximum number of times a word can be used is once. B would mean that the maximum number of times is twice. C would mean the maximum number of times is thrice, and D would mean the maximum number of times is 4 times. So actually, even though they put it in these small Roman letters, what you're really saying is once or twice or thrice or 4 times. Okay? So you've got to pick an answer here. Now, what are the words we're looking at? Well, he changed his decision in a dash of seconds. Well, I know that we can use in a matter of seconds. He changed his decision in a matter of seconds. Okay, so that's once. I can't say he changed his decision in a material of seconds, or in an affair of seconds, or in an issue of seconds. Okay. No important issue was left undiscussed at the meeting. Normally. I would normally look at the word issue. No important issue was left undiscussed. But I can also say no important matter was left undiscussed. I wouldn't say no important material was left undiscussed. Well, there's a context for that when you're talking about particular resources in terms of documents that have been provided. And no important affair was left undiscussed. An affair is basically a relationship issue. So normally we are not looking at material and affair. We're looking at matter or issue. Then on a matter of principle, this is very clear. You don't say on a material of principle, you don't say on an affair of principle. You can say on an issue of principle, that's possible. But the more common statement is a matter of principle. So that's 3 times. On a matter of principle, I quit the job. The industry has a problem disposing of the waste. Well, it can be waste material, but it can also be waste matter, isn't it? It's not going to be waste affair, and it's not going to be waste issue. So I know that the word that can actually be used a maximum number of times is matter. And how many times can it be used? It can be used 4 times, and therefore my answer is D, which is 4 times. The word matter can be used 4 times. Are we okay? Got that? Now, the question itself was not, the words themselves were not terribly difficult. But what this does is it tells you that you must pay attention to your directions when you see them. Now, while this particular question type is not actually part of the CAT, the fact is it just is an indication that any questions, people can actually fool around with your directions. They can actually distort or write your directions in a manner that can confuse you. So be careful about the directions. Make sure that you read them as carefully as possible. So that's a lesson we learned from question 8 actually. But yes, we also recognize that there are different contextual uses for words. Let's look at 9. Over here, we want to substitute for the word. That means we need a synonym that would work in this context. So promulgate. What does the word promulgate mean? Well, when it comes to laws, the word promulgate would mean to initiate, to declare, right? So the government is going to promulgate the idea of the small family amongst the rural poor. So here, to promulgate the idea would mean to initiate and see that it is picked up. To initiate and get people to accept it. It's an idea. We're not talking about a law. We're not talking about an ordinance. We're talking about an idea, which means launch the idea and get it accepted. So if you're talking about launching the idea and getting it accepted, then what are we saying? Are we saying disseminate? Disseminate is only to spread. The idea of launching is not there. Appropriate, to appropriate is to use something for your own. Promote, that is it. To launch and to spread something is actually promote, right? We look at that. To permeate is to get through different levels. So we're not looking at permeation. We're looking at promoting. So to promote is to launch and to get the idea to be accepted. So there we are looking at the government is going to promote the idea of the small family. So that would be the most appropriate substitute. Okay, let's look at 10. Now this one says that there is a nonsense word here. It's a word that does not make sense. Now if you do get such a question, not going to happen in the CAT, at least not going by recent times, but it does happen in a few of the other exams. If you do get a question like that, that says that you have a nonsense word or a word that doesn't make sense, then don't even look at that word. Because if you look at the word, you tend to get caught up in the way it sounds and the way it appears, and then you think it has something to do with the word that you really want as an answer. So you just treat it like a blank and treat the sentence like a fill in the blank question and then fill in the blank. That's it. So dubbed as the chimpanzees of the new world because of their dash and intelligence. And if you say and intelligence, then the dash has to be something related to intelligence or similar to. Capuchins have found a way to make a living in almost every type of forested habitat within their range. So we have certain animals, these are small monkeys, and they found a way to make a living. Now they have found a way to make a living in almost every type of forested habitat, which means they have a certain quality. And that quality and their intelligence have got people to call them the chimpanzees of the new world. So if you're looking at the business of found a way to make a living in every type of forested habitat, it means that they adapt to all circumstances. They adapt to all environments. So it's not agility. Agility is about speed or the quickness of movement. It's not just about survival. It's not about resilience, because resilience is the ability to bounce back. It's actually about adaptability. So they are known for their adaptability and intelligence, and they've found a way to make a living in almost every type of environment. Okay. So adaptability is the word that you want. So don't even look at the word nimbus actually, because if you do, then you start thinking, oh, nimbus means cloudy, cloud. So is it related to this? So don't worry about it. Just abandon the word, think about it as a blank and fill in the blank. So the word we want here is adaptability. In the case of question 11, we are to identify the word that is inappropriate as a substitute, which means in that context there are 3 other words that can work apart from terminal, but one would not. So flamingos, the birds we know, the crane type birds which are pink, usually pink in color. Flamingos need large water bodies, but these habitats have been drained, sending the population into terminal decline. Now we know the context of this is that there is a negative impact on their population. That means their population is diminishing, right? And terminal here would mean diminishing to the point that it might actually get extinct, isn't it? So it might actually become extinct. That means finally we are actually going to see the fact that they don't exist anymore. So you want 3 words that would suit that context, but one which is not. We're talking about diminishing to the point of not being there anymore. So I could look at irreversible because it will continue to diminish until they go away. I could look at ultimate because it means that the diminution is going to mean that ultimately they will actually go away. And permanent decline would mean that this decline is irreversible. That means it's going to keep happening until it finishes. Lethal, on the other hand, is only something that means capable of causing death. So we're not talking about lethal decline. So something that is related to death or capable of causing death. Here we're talking about the species diminishing in population until they vanish. So irreversible, ultimate, permanent would work, but D, namely lethal, would not work. Okay, so that would be inappropriate in the context. Coming to question 12. Here you have 4 words in capital letters, and one of the words in the choices can be associated with every one of these 4 capitalized words. So the words I have are favors, line, spirit and peace. So help, okay, favors could be looked at as, let us say, you might provide someone favors. It could be that you help them. A helpline works because a helpline is a telephone line on which you can seek assistance. You could have a helping spirit, though we don't normally use that. We use the word team for spirit, not so much help for spirit. And peace, no, help doesn't work with that. Hard, well, you can't have hard favors. You can take a hard line. A hard line is where you are very rigid or very obstinate or very stubborn. Hard spirit, well, hard spirits are basically the opposite of soft drinks. Soft drinks are non-alcoholic, hard spirits are alcoholic. Hard peace, well, that is only saying soft peace, hard peace. So it's not a word we normally associate with peace. Team, you don't have team favors, you don't have a team line, you do have a team spirit, and there is certainly no team peace. But party, well, there are party favors. Party favors would mean, well, what we now call return gifts, right? So somebody comes to your party and you give them little gifts when they leave because you thank them for coming to your party. So they're called party favors. A party line is the line that an entire political party takes. That means a stand that they all adopt together. A party spirit is where you really want to, you have the whole spirit of the whole team shares the spirit of wanting to enjoy themselves. And a party piece is something that you as an individual are well known for, and everyone asks you to perform that at a party. So somebody sings a particular song very well, and whenever there's a party and people want to enjoy themselves, and they say, why don't you sing that song that you're so good at? So that is a person's party piece. Okay, so party works with all 4. So the answer that we have here is D, which is party. So party favors, return gifts. Party line, the stand or unanimous stand that the group takes. Party spirit, the attitude of having a good time. And party piece, the one thing that you are known for, that you keep performing at parties. Okay, so that is party then. 13, here this is what we call an analogy. Now why do we practice these things and why does it help us? Because words in sentences are always, or usually, not always, but usually indicative of thoughts that can follow. There are certain associations that you make with certain words, and that helps you anticipate what a person might talk about. So basically, to train ourselves to do that, we do these particular kinds of questions because it helps us work out the associations. So certainly you realize that over here we are saying that the capitalized words are associated in a certain form with each other, and therefore you want an pair that either presents the same sort of association or does not. Over here we want does not, which means three of them are going to be associated in the same manner as the basic ones. One of them is not going to be. So what do we have? We have obfuscation and clarity. Now obfuscation and clarity. To obfuscate something would mean to make it very unclear, to generally muddy things up, to generally obscure them, is when you obfuscate. So that means when you tell a person don't obfuscate, you're saying don't just talk around the point so that it's not clear, don't make things unclear, please make things clear. So obfuscation and clarity are opposites then. So obfuscation is where things are being made unclear, clarity is where they are actually made clear. So three of them are going to be opposites and one is not. Inanity and sagacity. Well, inanity is emptiness of meaning. So typically when people are empty of meaning or they are stupid, then we say they are inane. But a sagacious person is very wise. So obviously those are opposites. So inanity and sagacity are opposites. Proclivity and penchant. The proclivity is an inclination towards something, a tendency towards something. A penchant is also a liking or an inclination that to do something. So they are synonyms. So these are not antonyms, they are synonyms. Whereas we are looking at an antonymous pair. So three of them are going to be antonymous, whereas one is not going to be antonymous. Therefore B is probably our answer. But let's look at C. Amiability and hostility are very clearly opposites, because amiable is friendly, hostile is like an enemy. Despondency and exhilaration, opposites again. Despondency is sadness, exhilaration is a great amount of enthusiasm or happiness. So that means A, C and D work the same way that the basic pair does. The one that doesn't is B, that is proclivity and penchant, which are synonyms. All the others are antonymous. So 13, your answer would be B. 14, we need a pair of words to fit the blanks. So this is typically about knowing context and identifying the right kind of words. We must be aware that the policies and programs that specifically target the economic development of the marginalized, namely if you have policies and programs that are specifically targeted towards the development of the less fortunate people, the marginalized, cannot serve as a dash for a cultural roadmap that counteracts the dash symbols and practices of domination. Now as it is, it would seem as if this is something that favors them. As it is, we're looking at this seems to favor the marginalized. Policies and programs that specifically target. But something that is positive cannot serve as, and then we say cultural roadmap that counteracts the symbols and practices. That means this is really positive. So it means one alone will not do. It cannot be a substitute for two. So one alone cannot be a substitute for two is what we understand. So we would tend to look at words that look at something like substitute. So we go down to C almost directly, because yes, I can look at cannot serve as a substitute, but then when I say the inveterate, now what is inveterate? Inveterate really means habitual. Are we saying habitual symbols and practices of domination? Are we saying they are part of habit, or are we saying that they are ingrained in society? So I need a word that tells me that these practices are ingrained, we need to root them out, and simply having a program that looks at economic development is not good enough. Apart from looking at economic development, you have to take out something that is deeply rooted. So I need a word for deeply rooted. In which case I could look at ingrained, I could look at entrenched. Because ingrained symbols would mean that they are deeply rooted. Entrenched also means they are deeply rooted. Inveterate does not. Inveterate would mean that they are habitual. Cantonal does not. Cantonal would mean that they are according to principles, right? Or they are provincial, right? That means just in certain localities or provinces. So that's not what we're looking at. So if I look at ingrained, then I have betrayal. So you can't say it cannot serve as a betrayal. But I could say it cannot serve as a proxy, because the word proxy actually means a substitute. That means something speaking on behalf of something else. So you can't have economic programs as a proxy for what you need to uproot cultural, let us say, prejudices, right? So proxy would work. So that means B is going to be your answer here, because proxy can work in the first blank and entrenched elsewhere. So These programs cannot serve as a proxy for a cultural roadmap that counteracts the entrenched symbols of practices and practices of domination. So B would be your answer. And let's look at 15. This is called a closed passage. In a closed passage, you actually have an entire paragraph and you have to fill in blanks in the paragraph. But the idea is that the blanks actually have some relationship to the context of the paragraph itself. So you must know what the paragraph is trying to say as you fill the blanks. So it's good to read the whole thing, get a sense of what they're talking about, and arrive at an idea of what goes into the blank. So when the Mauryan Empire fell apart, foreign invaders conquered and successively ruled the northern sector, while the southern region remained mostly subject to dash rule. That means if foreign invaders ruled the north while the southern region, that means we are saying that the southern region basically was subject to local rule, not foreign invaders. The basic reason for this difference was that the plough-using villages dashed the economy of the part. It should be part. Okay? There should be a P here. Alright? So, the reason for this is that the plough-using villages dashed the economy of the part conquered by the foreigners. That means the northern parts. So, what is it about plough-using villages? Okay, plough-using villages would mean agricultural, who mainly looted the surplus gathered under the preceding rulers. And we know that if you're talking about the Mauryan Empire time, the only production was agriculture. So the surplus would actually have to be surplus crop. So the basic reason for the difference was that the plough using, that means the agricultural villages basically they constituted the economy of the northern part, and the foreigners looted the surplus gathered under preceding rulers. That means 16 has to look at basically were the main part of the economy. So 15 talks about, let's say, local rulers in the south. 16 talks about agriculture being the main part of the economy. And the south had still to be covered by such dash unresisting villages. Such villages. That means the ones in the north were unresisting. The ones in the north just allowed things to happen. And the south was not like that. So I know the 7th requires allowed things to happen. So what would 15 be? If 15 talks about local rule, then it has to be indigenous. Because the word indigenous would mean belonging to that area. It can't be inherent, because inherent is born within. It's not inborn, it's not inherent, it's not intrinsic, but it is local rule, mostly subject to local rule, therefore indigenous. Okay. Then the basic reason for this difference was that the plough using villages, and then they were the major part of the economy, so they dominated the economy. They dominated the economy of that part conquered by the foreigners. Okay. So it can't be tyrannized, because tyrannized would mean severely oppressed. It can't be overruled, it can't be bullied. It has to be that the agriculture as an activity dominated the economy of these parts. So A. And then 17 we said allowing things to happen, more in the nature of allowing things to happen. That means not having a voice or a force of your own. So what would that be? So it can't be untouched unresisting village, it can't be unstirred unresisting village. It can't be docile alone, but it has to be passive. Passive is, I'm not going to lift a finger, whatever happens, happens. Which means, I'm not going to resist. I've got resistance. So, passive, unresisting villages. So, you'd actually want D. Docile is easily tamed. No, we are saying let things happen. I'm not going to do anything against them, let things happen. So, it's more in the nature of passive. So that is your answer here. So what do we have here? Then read the whole thing together. So when the Mauryan Empire fell apart, foreign invaders conquered and successfully ruled the northern sector, while the southern region remained mostly subject to indigenous rule. The basic reason for this difference was that plough-using villages dominated the economy of the part conquered by the foreigners, who mainly looted the surplus gathered under preceding rulers. The south had still to be covered by such passive, unresisting villages. Okay, so that finishes this question. Now let's move on to question 18. This is about a word that has different contextual uses, and we have to identify which of the uses here is incorrect. Okay, so the word we are given is repeat. Now the Home Minister told the army officers that they have to at any cost prevent the repeat of the subversive infiltration. That means a repetition of. We do use it in that sense. The repeat of is a repetition of the infiltration. So this works. This is okay. Then the teacher asked her students not to repeat her, but listen to her in silence. No, if they were going to repeat, they would repeat after her. So this is wrong, because if you're going to use the word repeat here, you need to say the teacher asked her students not to repeat after her. So you need after here. You need after here, which is why this one is wrong. Okay, so this one is wrong then, because you don't use repeat by itself in that context. He repeated it several times, which means he said things again and again. That is okay. Don't miss the repeat of the program. That means the program will run again. So we call it don't miss the repeat of the program. So that part is fine. So what we want here as an error is B, because it would be not to repeat after her. Okay, so that would be appropriate use of the word. What about 19? This is about confusables. That means words that we often are confused about, and we need to be able to identify which one actually is relevant to the sentence. So we do have choices down there, and the choices given to us, we could probably work backwards from them, but it would actually help to work straight away, because it just helps us build our vocabulary. It seemed or appeared to him that noon recess would never come. No, if it is a feeling that you get, if it's a sensation that you get, it's almost as if I will not have noon recess. It would be seemed, not appeared. Appeared would mean the way you look at things. Seem is the way you feel things. So it seemed to him that the noon recess would never come. It was the sleepiest of sleepy days. It was the sleepiest of sleepy days. There was not a leaf shaking or stirring. No, you normally talk about leaves stirring in the breeze, not shaking in the breeze. If they are shaking, then there's a very strong wind. Stirring is the lightest little bit of breeze is going to cause a leaf to stir. There was not a leaf stirring would mean there wasn't even the lightest bit of wind. So stirring is what you want. Away off in the flaming sunshine, Cardiff Hill was lightly or faintly visible through a shimmering veil of heat. If you didn't really see it very clearly, but only in some sort of hazy form, then you'll say it was faintly visible, not lightly. Okay? So it was faintly visible through a shimmering veil of heat. A few birds floated on lazy wing or lazy wind high in the air. Now who's lazy? Is the wind is the wind lazy? If the birds could float on the wind, then the wind was not lazy. The wind was actually keeping them up. So what was lazy is the fact that they didn't have to flap their wings. They didn't have to make the effort. So that was lazy. So a few birds floated on lazy wing is what you want. Okay? A few birds floated on lazy wing high in the air. No other living thing was visible but some cows, and they were asleep. Now when you say but for, it means if it weren't for someone. So but for my friends I would have failed would mean if it weren't for my friends I would fail. But no one was there but my friends. Okay, so but is exception, so you want that. No other living thing was available but some cows. Not but for some cows. But for would be, but for some cows we wouldn't have dairy products that way. So if it were not for them. So that's not the context. So that means the choice we have is A, B, B, A, B. So B is going to be your choice over here. Fine. So that answers this question. And what about 20? Well, 20 is a grammar statement. It's just about identifying the correct structure over here. So now you realize that so far we've looked at vocabulary and idioms and metaphors and so on. And that means if we do know them, then our reading becomes more effective because we can pick up the meaning of a sentence fast, we can anticipate what might follow, we can associate words with them. And so all the benefits that we can derive from having good vocabulary is something that actually is demonstrated in the reading that we do. So yes, what these questions did so far up to 19 was they demonstrated to you the importance of vocabulary. They helped you recognize that with good vocabulary you can read better. And your study material is going to have lots of practice exercises like that. So the more you work on them along with your reading habit, okay, the better your reading is going to get. Now let's look at the grammar type things. The bus was so crowded, so we had to stand all the way. But you realize that when you say so, in this case of making a comparison with something more than you expect, you'll have to say so that. So I need to look at that. So that is available to me in A, B and C. But let's just look at that. The bus was so crowded that. I can't say the bus was too crowded that. I can't say the bus was very crowded that. I'll have to say the bus was so crowded that we had to stand all the way. This is standard use of two words to present a phrase. It's what we call a prepositional phrase. So crowded that. So that is a prepositional pair. So the bus was so crowded that we had to stand all the way. It can't be so crowded so we had to stand. Alright, so C is going to be the answer to your question. What about 21? Mark it as A if there's an error only in the one sentence, B if there's only in the second sentence, C if there are errors in both sentences, and D if there are no errors at all. The girl's friends were making fun at her. They don't make fun at someone, you make fun of them. So the girl's friends were making fun of her, not at. Therefore, 1 is wrong. The research provides evidence that Japanese are highly talented, but we're referring to a nationality, we're referring to a people, we're referring to a particular people of a particular nation. So we'll have to say that the Japanese are highly talented people. Okay, so that means both these statements are wrong and the answer would actually be C. Fair enough? Okay. Let's look at 22 then. True devotion is defined as that which is resolute. Okay, it's resolute. And read it to the first sentence. And the mind of such a devotee engages in the Almighty incessantly like a steady flow of oil. It has to be the mind of such a devotee. It can't just be the mind of such devotee. Because you're referring to a single devotee, you have to say the mind of such a devotee. So I'll have to look at B, C or D. So let's go down to B then. Now B says, and the mind of such a devotee incessantly engages in the Almighty, like a steady flow of oil. But incessantly engages in the Almighty, would we say that, or we would put the incessantly later? Because like a steady flow of oil is a description of the flow, unceasing. Incessantly means unceasing. So I have to have a connection between the engaging the Almighty and the steady flow of oil. So the incessantly would actually have to come after. So I have to look at incessantly after, not before, because then it will connect the engaging the Almighty with the steady flow of oil. So incessantly I've got to look at C or D. So let's look at C then. And the mind of such a devotee engages in Almighty. No, it has to be the Almighty. You don't just say Almighty, it has to be the Almighty. Therefore, I need the Almighty, which means D is the answer to our question. So now let's read D. True devotion is defined as that which is resolute, and the mind of such a devotee engages in the Almighty incessantly like a steady flow of oil. Okay? Right. Why do we have incessantly here? Because you're talking about it engages the Almighty almost like a steady flow of oil. So unceasingly like a steady flow of oil. So that means the incessantly would be the connection between the engaging the Almighty and the steady flow of oil. So you place incessantly here after the Almighty. So D would be the answer to 22. What about 23? Here we are identifying those sentences which are correct, right? Those sentences which are correct and appropriate. So what do we have? Sweet are the uses of adversity. Fine, that's a very poetical way of saying it. Normally we would say the uses of adversity are sweet, but we can say sweet are the uses of adversity. So this is okay. B. Adversity can prove highly beneficial for mankind. Do you talk about something being beneficial for or being beneficial to? So basically it has to be adversity can prove highly beneficial to mankind. So not for. Okay. Then C. Having once been through adverse circumstances, one is certain to face the rest of one's life with greater courage and confidence than when? Then before you went through those circumstances. Therefore C is okay. Having once been through adverse circumstances, one is certain to face the rest of one's life with greater courage and confidence, and the implied one is with greater courage and confidence than compared to when they hadn't gone through these circumstances. So C is okay. Then, what about D then? He who has never suffered cannot understand what is suffering? No. He who has never suffered cannot understand what suffering is. Not what is suffering, but what suffering is. The is will come here. Okay. So that is why that one is wrong. So what we have is correct is only A and C. So the answer here would be B. What about 24? Here we are talking about again identifying lines which are correct. Okay. Now 24, and we are looking at identifying what is correct, and we have choices here. Correct. we've got A, B, C, D choices. So we've got to pick what we think and then look at the choices. So let's look at this. Lying is universal. We all do it. Lying is universal. Basic statement. We all do it. Basic statement. Therefore, comma, the wise thing is for us to, okay, up to that point we're okay. The wise thing is for us to train ourselves diligently to lie judiciously. So I know A is okay, but let's look at B. To train ourselves diligently to lie judiciously, to lie with good intentions, not evil ones. 2, and since it's not finished, let's continue the whole thing. To lie with good intentions, not evil ones. To lie gracefully, not clumsily. To lie firmly with head erect, not haltingly as with shame. Only then we will be worthy dwellers in a world where even benign natures. So when you say only then we will be, actually if you're making a declaration like that or an assertion, it will be only then will we be, not only then we will be. That means D is wrong. Okay, so D is wrong. E, where even nature habitually lies except when she promises, even benign nature habitually lies except when she promises acceptable weather. Now would you say nature habitually lies or nature lies habitually? So it will be nature lies habitually, right? So that would be wrong as well. That means D and E are wrong. So D and E are wrong. I know that A is right. Okay, so let's go back to considering B and C then. Now, therefore the wise thing is for us to train ourselves diligently to lie judiciously. Now if I'm going to say to train ourselves to lie judiciously, then the diligently can't come in between those, because basically I'm saying we train ourselves to lie judiciously. Then the business is about the training is diligent. So we have to diligently train ourselves. Okay, so the wise thing is for us to diligently train ourselves. The diligently will come here because it refers to the training, not to lying judiciously. Okay, so we have to diligently train ourselves to lie judiciously. So B is wrong. And then continue. To lie with good intentions, not evil ones. To lie gracefully, not clumsily. To lie firmly with head erect, not haltingly as with shame. Okay, so C is okay. So A and C are correct, in which case the answer would actually be C. A and C. Alright, so that finishes that. Now, what about 25? Here we are talking about a sentence that delivers an idea, but it's written in slightly different ways, and you've got to find the one that is correct and concise, both. So what do I have? The recent EU regulation forbidding airlines and tour operators from denying travel to passengers with disabilities and reduced mobility, besides affirming the principle of anti-discrimination, also makes sound business sense. The recent EU regulation forbidding airlines and tour operators from denying. Okay, you forbid them to deny. Okay, so it can't. Okay, forbidding from, forbidding to. Actually, basically, when you're forbidden from something, it means you're stopped from doing something. When you're forbidden to doing something, then you're banned from doing it. So I actually want forbidding to. Or if I'm looking at forbidding from, then I'm looking at an activity that has to come to a stop. So forbidden from is an activity that must come to a stop. Forbidden to is an activity that should never happen. Okay, so let's just keep A there. Because the recent EU regulation forbidding airlines and tour operators from denying travel to passengers with disabilities and reduced mobility, besides affirming the. So if I'm going to look at this, I'd also have to have a comma here, because I'm saying that what we really want here is that this whole thing also makes sound business sense. Okay, so the recent EU regulation which forbidding airlines and tour operators from denying travel to passengers with disabilities and reduced mobility also makes sound business sense, apart from what else it does. And therefore, the besides affirming the principle of anti-discrimination is an insertion. So I need a comma here. So let's see. B says, apart from confirming to the idea that discrimination in any form should not be allowed. First of all, it can't be confirming, it has to be conforming. Also, this is a very strange way of saying it. So this has to be conforming. Apart from conforming to the idea that discrimination in any form should not be allowed, the new EU regulation which forbids airlines and tour operators from denying travel to passengers with disabilities and reduced mobility also is useful, as it comes as an opportunity to improve the business of the airline industry. This is a very large thing. To make sound business sense and improve the business of the airline industry, you're not being very precise there. And then you're saying apart from conforming to the idea, though it should be conforming and not confirming. So this is a very large sentence, and anyway with confirming it's actually wrong. Now let's look at C then. So what does C say? C says the recent EU regulation that does not permit any kind of discrimination in the travel industry on the basis of disability and related issues is beneficial in terms of business too. Okay, so that makes sense. So the recent EU regulation that does not permit any kind of discrimination in the travel industry on the basis of disability and related issues, I need a comma here as well actually, is beneficial in terms of business too. Okay. D. The recent EU regulation regarding airlines and disabled people does not support discrimination in the airlines industry. No, we are not saying that the regulation does not support discrimination. It says it tells you cannot discriminate. So D is clearly out. So let's compare A and C. Now A says the recent EU regulation forbidding airlines and tour operators from denying. The fact is you're actually banning it. You're telling them you can't do this. You cannot deny them that. Therefore, you're actually making the regulation. So you're not actually just giving them guidance. You're not actually telling them you were doing this so long, so now you can't do it. Forbidding them from denying travel. So this is a slightly long statement. Now, A does make some sense. It's not grammatically incorrect, but you want a really concise idea. So this forbidding airlines and tour operators from denying travel to passengers with disabilities and reduced mobility, compare it to this. That does not permit any kind of discrimination on the basis of disability and related issues. Much more concise. Is beneficial in terms of business too. Now both of them do need commas, you know that, which means I need a comma in A, I also need a comma in C. But the fact is that in terms of precise construction, C is much more effective. So C would be the answer to the question here. So 25, the answer is C. The recent EU regulation that does not permit any kind of discrimination in the travel industry on the basis of disability and related issues is beneficial in terms of business too. Fine. Now let's come now to 26. This one should be really easy. Mark the letter corresponding to the part that has an error. Okay. So what we have, while today's ideological cleavages, that means the differences in ideology, are not as wide as that of the 1930s. But we're talking about cleavages. We are saying there are various differences, and therefore there were differences in the 1930s. So normally it would not be while as that of, it will have to be those of. So you need those here. So that means B is incorrect. While today's ideological cleavages are not as wide as those of the 1930s, they are nonetheless more pronounced than at any time since the Cold War. Fine. So that means B is our answer to 26. Let's look at 27. This is about putting the sentence into sequence. But it does require a recognition of grammar, isn't it? When you realize what the grammatical elements are, what the clauses are, what the phrases are, then you can actually put it into sequence. So what do we have here? A long step towards goodwill among nations. Okay. Now, and the advocates of this view can certainly offer many arguments in its favor. So what is the view? The view is widely held. Okay, so the view is widely held that the word would be taking a long step. So I know I probably want to start with C. Okay, and then A is very clearly connected. So the view is widely held that the world would be taking a long step toward goodwill among nations if it were to adopt a universal language. Okay, so that would be D. And the advocates of this view can certainly offer many arguments in its favor, and that would be B. So basically, you know that you start with the view is widely held that the world would be taking a long step towards goodwill among nations if it were to adopt a universal language, and the advocates of this view can certainly offer many arguments in its favor. So CADV is your sequence. You realize you've actually used grammar here in some sense, because you realize what the content is, but you also realize what the main ideas are and what the ancillaries are. So I have a compound sentence here which has two main clauses. The first main clause being that there is a certain view, and the second main clause being that the advocates of this view can offer arguments. So CADV is going to be the sentence that we finalize. Okay, now let's look at 28. Now this one is what we call a para-jumble. Now a para-jumble is a current question type. It is something that has a certain approach that we need to keep in mind. We're not going to be discussing approaches here today because that also requires discussing paragraph types, the way paragraphs are written, but we will have a separate video. We will have a separate video and a separate session on discussing para type questions and how to handle them. Today, it is only to give ourselves a sense of the kind of thinking that goes into paragraphs so that we start looking for that kind of thinking in the reading that we do. Alright, so let's look at all 5 sentences and then try and make a sequence. So, malicious programs make use of the period between it being identified. So I know the it is something that has to be talked about first before I come down to 1. So what is the it? I don't know. So malicious programs make use of the period between it being identified and a security patch for the program becoming available to infect workstations. So it must be the one that is causing harm, isn't it? They make use of the period between it being identified and a repair work being done. So the it must be the harm caused or the injury caused. So where is the injury given to me? So that has to come before 1. Now 2, attacks via web browsers have dramatically increased over the years. Now that's a very general sort of statement, and obviously malicious programs and anything harmful happening to a computer is going to be because of an attack. So that means this has to be a statement that comes before 1 because it opens up the discussion, isn't it? Attacks via web browsers and have dramatically increased over the years. Now, laptops and other mobile devices are particularly vulnerable. Employees use the same devices to work from home or hotels and airports. So I'm not sure where 3 comes because it actually is how do attacks happen, isn't it? Laptops and other devices are particularly vulnerable. 3 could actually come after 2, but we'll hold off on that until we've read the others. Okay. Laptops and other mobile devices are particularly vulnerable. Employees use the same devices to work from home or hotels and airports. Okay. What about the other 3? So here I've got, I know that 2 is possibly going to begin. I know that 1 comes later. I'm not too sure about 3. Now, employees endanger the corporate network when they inadvertently introduce backdoor programs downloaded via malicious websites. Then this does not talk about devices, but it does talk about attacks. Now you realize if I look at 4 and I look at 2, 1 and 3. Now 1 only talks about how the attacks work. 2 tells me attacks are happening. 3 tells me which devices are vulnerable to attacks. But 4 tells me when the attacks happen. So attacks are happening, when do they happen? When employees endanger the corporate network, when they inadvertently introduce backdoor programs downloaded via malicious websites. So I know that 4 would actually come here. Then the malicious website is moving on to 1, which says malicious programs make use of the period between the program being identified and the time security patch to infect workstations. So I know that 2, 4 would actually lead to 1. Now 3 tells me what is most vulnerable. So with all these attacks, the ones which are most vulnerable are 3. That means laptops and mobile devices are particularly vulnerable because employees use these same devices wherever they are, at home or hotels and airports. And therefore these devices connect to different access networks which may be the source of an infection. So 5 is telling you why the multiple use of these across different areas would mean that they are open to different networks which therefore could deliver the infection. So 2, 4, 1, 3, 5 would be the sequence you're looking at, right? Let's just read in that sequence then. Alright. 2 first. Attacks via web browsers have dramatically increased over the years. Employees endanger the corporate network when they inadvertently introduce backdoor programs downloaded via malicious websites. Malicious programs make use of the period between it being identified and a security patch for the program becoming available to infect workstations. Laptops and other mobile devices are particularly vulnerable. Employees use the same devices to work from home or hotels and airports. These devices connect to different access networks which may be a source of infection. Fine. So that makes sense there. So 2, 4, 1, 3, 5 is what you put in the box. Okay. So this is your non-MCQ question, or what everyone now calls a TETA question. Okay. 2, 4, 1, 3, 5. Let's look at 29. 29 is about completing a paragraph. Now this is also a para-type question. It didn't appear last year, but it is a common question in the CAT. So we consider it a current CAT question type. The para is in order. Our job is to identify what it is that the para is talking about and find the word that completes that discussion. Find the sentence that completes that discussion. So let's look at this. For the first time, light is being investigated seriously as a human health hazard. a possible contributor to the increased incidence of cancer, depression and other ailments. Now that is for humans. And for many wildlife species, light pollution seems to be as grave as an environmental threat as bulldozed habitats and toxic dumping. And this is for non-humans. That means light is a hazard not only for humans but also for non-humans. So how would I want to close this? I'd want to talk about the fact that this means that the whole world is affected by it, isn't it? All of the world and everything, that means everything in the world is affected by it in that sense. Now if I look at A, nearly 2/3 of the world's population lives under the night sky is polluted by light. Then I'm only looking at people. If we look at B, Bryant Weiner, a biology professor at UCal, has conducted experiments in which he showed that even a dim nightlight is enough to blind frogs. Now this looks at only at animals, and it takes forward a discussion on animals, that's it. But I'm talking about something that is going to affect everything in the universe, in the world, whether human or non-human. The implications are far bigger than ever realized, and people have begun to take the issue much more seriously, which means if it's going to affect both humans and non-humans, we really need to do something about it. That means it's going to affect everything, so we must do something about it. So C seems a much better closure than A or B. What about D? Canada has set up a light conservation reserve north of Toronto, the first of its kind in the world. This is a different thing. This is what a specific country is doing with regard to light. So C is actually what you're looking at, because having said that light is being investigated as seriously human health hazard, it starts with that also. And then being investigated, we realize that it contributes to human ailments. It also contributes to, let's say, non-human problems, and therefore it's much bigger than we first thought, and we have to take it more seriously. So C makes absolute sense. Okay, so 29, the answer would be C. What about 30? Here we are talking about, let's say, finding the odd one out. Okay, finding the odd one out, because 4 sentences actually fit the, let's say, paragraph. One doesn't. Now, and scientific progress is a force that's apt to create rather than solve thorny ethical issues. This is about science solving issues. Take the controversy about embryonic stem cells research, for example. So this is an example of a controversy. So 2 is an example of a controversy. So 1 only says that scientific progress is likely to cause problems. Now 3, the US Roman Catholic bishops oppose it, saying that life should be regarded as sacred from the moment of conception. So the it here can't be scientific progress, right? It has to be about human life. So it could be about embryonic stem cell research. So I know that 2 and 3 are actually related. 1 is slightly external. What about 4? But scientists, patient advocates, drug companies, clinics and some politicians and some government healthcare officials are banking on the research program's promise of treatment and even cures for, there needs to be an E here, okay? And even cures for disease like Alzheimer's. So what program? The stem cell research program, isn't it? Embryonic stem cell research program. Okay, so 2 and 4 are definitely related, but 3 tells you that it's related because somebody is not in favor of it. So there is a controversy. The controversy, so take the controversy about embryonic stem cell research, for example. Where is the controversy? Well, some people oppose it in 3, but some people support it in 4. Now, technological change can alter the costs and benefits of adhering to certain beliefs. Now, technological change can alter the costs and benefits of adhering to certain beliefs. Where is that taken forward? Well, that's taken forward in 2. Where, take the controversy about embryonic stem cell research, for example. That means 5 would be what we begin with, and we would then progress to 2. That's the example. And the example then tells me what the controversy is, because it tells me that the church actually opposes it, but it tells me that a lot of other things actually support it, right? So 5, 2, 3, 4 would be the sequence, and 1 would be the odd one out. So this one doesn't fit. So I know that the sequence would be 5, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 5, 2, 3, 4, and the odd statement would actually be 1. So let's just read 5, 2, 3, 4 together. Technological change can alter the costs and benefits of adhering to certain beliefs. Take the controversy about embryonic stem cell research, for example. The US Roman Catholic bishop oppose it, saying that life should be regarded as sacred, but scientists, etc., are banking on the promise of treatment and even cures for diseases like Alzheimer's and type 1 diabetes. What about 1? And scientific progress is a force that's apt to create rather than solve thorny ethical issues. This is actually about scientific progress totally. Whereas the basic statement is about technological change. So 1 is the odd one out and 5, 2, 3, 4 is the sequence that we will adopt. So 1 is the answer over here. So that finishes question 30. Question 31 asks us to capture the essence of the text. So this would be what we call a summary type question. It comes to us with slightly different directions, which we'll discuss in a different video. One direction is to capture the essence of the text, one direction is to capture the best summary, one is to capture the author's position. They are all summary type questions, but the focus of the summary is slightly different in each case. But we'll talk about that in a different session, okay? When we discuss paragraphs and author's purpose and so on. Today let's have a look at what this involves and what kind of thinking we should do when we handle this kind of stuff. So what we have here in 31. When some feature of an event seems similar to an emotionally charged memory from the past, the mind responds by triggering the feelings that went with the remembered event. The emotional mind reacts to the present as though it were the past. The trouble is that especially when the appraisal is fast and automatic, we may not realize that what was once the case is no longer so. Someone who has learned through painful childhood beatings to react to an angry scowl with intense fear and loathing will have that reaction in some degree even as an adult, even though the scowl carries no such threat. So that means this is an example of the basic idea. This is an example. Someone who has learned through painful beatings to react to an angry scowl with intense fear and loathing will have that reaction in some degree even as an adult, even though the scowl carries no such threat. So this is an example to tell us that previous experience sometimes causes you to fear things even though there is no reason for fear. That means the basic idea is that previous experience causes us to be troubled about things even though there might not be reason for anxiety. So what's the idea? When some feature of event seems similar to an emotionally charged memory from the past, the mind responds by triggering the feelings that went with the remembered event. The emotional mind reacts to the present as though it were the past. That means you treat this as if it was that. The trouble is that especially when the appraisal is fast and automatic, we may not realize that what was once the case is no longer so, which means we sometimes respond to the present with the same anxiety as we did for similar situation in the past, even though today's situation may not actually be similar. Okay. Now let's look at A. Distancing ourselves from the past is tough, especially when it comes to unpleasant experiences. Alright. Someone who has learned through painful childhood beatings to react to the event that caused it in a particular way, he or she is likely to show a similar reaction when faced with a similar situation even as an adult. Here the summary is more about the example than the discussion. So the focus is more on the example than the discussion. But can we look at a choice that actually focuses on the idea itself? So maybe we will keep away from A for the moment. Let's look at B. People may react in ways that are not proportionate to a stimulus encountered in the present, as past reactions to a similar stimulus are unconsciously brought to mind, which means we respond to things going by our past experience even though the present may not be the same as the past. And that is the idea itself. The child's reaction is the example. So the idea is actually properly presented in B. Let's see. What about C? Our past is imposed on the present. No. We're not saying our past is imposed on the present. We are saying we treat the present like the past. So it's a little too extreme to say our past is imposed on the present. Consciously or unconsciously. Our past experiences tend to stay with us, and the learned responses which come out of those experiences are likely to come out naturally when we find ourselves in a situation that simulates the one we went through in the past. No. Not that simulates. That is not exactly similar to. Seems similar but is not exactly the same. So C is wrong for two reasons. One is about the is imposed on the past, and the one is about the situation that simulates the one we went through. So we are not looking at C. D. We all tend to mix the past with the present. We all tend to mix the past with the present. The present is a continuation of the past, and hence we tend to live with the past also to an extent. Lots of new thoughts here. First of all, mixing the past with the present, that is a new thought. Okay, where's my pen? Okay, so this is a new thought. Then the present is a continuation of the past with a new thought. One has to avoid bringing back memories of the past as it then affects present functioning. So where is this recommendation being made? So all of this is entirely new. So D just has totally unrelated content actually. So B then, which sums up the idea and doesn't focus so much on the example, is actually the answer we want. So B is the answer to this question. Let's look at the next one. This one is about capturing the author's position. That means, what's the author's viewpoint here? Despite its Latin roots in the Latin licere, which means be permitted, leisure is understood as the withdrawal from activities and work rather than a permission to do things. In short, the term as it is constructed today is basically part of the work-leisure binary. This is problematic. Once leisure becomes the other of work, it can only run after work, trying desperately to catch up and largely failing to do so. Because if you're saying that it's basically work and apart from work you have leisure, then we are never going to have as much leisure as we have work. It can only run after work, trying desperately to catch up and largely failing to do so. Because even if it is celebrated, that means even if you actually appreciate leisure a great deal, it remains impossible. Leisure ends up being either that empty space where one does not really act or work, or that mirage one is always working to reach. You're always trying to reach a point where you think that you have leisure, so you don't really have it, and it's never really going to be equal to your work. So, in the latter sense which predominates, that means the mirage that we're trying to reach, the only way to obtain leisure is to work more in order to work less one day. So the more leisure one wants, the harder one works. In other words, to get that mirage, you have to say, I've got to make the time, so for that I've got to work hard now. And therefore, the more leisure you want, the harder you have to work. In other words, the author is really trying to tell us that we will never really reach a point where leisure will be as much to us as work is, but to try and create more leisure for ourselves, we actually end up working even harder. Okay, so that's the idea itself. So let's see what he has. So the word leisure is widely misinterpreted, and the current perception of leisure is something which one should work hard for. No, the distortion here is the word leisure is widely misinterpreted. Current perception of leisure is one. No. The point is, he's saying it's come to a point where it's so difficult to achieve that if you really want it, you have to work very, very hard. So leisure has now become so difficult to achieve, so elusive, that cannot be obtained unless one toils extra hard. Okay. So let's just keep 2 there and compare it to the rest. What about 3? Leisure as it is perceived today is intimately associated with work and can be obtained only if one works extra hard. Well, that also is actually some part of what the author says. So 3 is also there in some sense. Okay. 4. Contrary to its original meaning, the popular perception of leisure is a mirage one is always working to reach. Well, this is not relevant because it's actually about hard work to be able to achieve leisure. So since if I'm going to look at 2, then I've got to look at 3 as well. So now let me compare 2 and 3 with 1. The word leisure is widely misinterpreted. He actually says, isn't it? Leisure is withdrawal, understood as withdrawal from activities and work rather than the permission to do things. But basically, we would look at it as a withdrawal and a desire that we want to achieve. So yeah, he is talking about the fact that the word needs to be looked at carefully. Its Latin roots means be permitted, but we look at it as withdrawal from activities. But basically what we want is a period of time when we don't have to work, isn't it? And if we really want to do that, then we have to work even harder to do it, which means 1 is actually relevant. The word leisure is widely misinterpreted. The current perception, that means our let's say, that is, leisure is understood to be the withdrawal from activities, and it is constructed to be basically part of the work-leisure binary, which means leisure is what should we say, is considered today to be that, let's say, that antithesis of work, which means you work and then you can achieve leisure. And that would mean that perception is therefore something that we should work hard for, because the harder we work, then we will actually build for ourselves, more leisure we'll get. So yeah, the point is that 2 and 3 actually talk about the same thing. And if I'm going to pick 2, then I've got to pick 3 as well, which means there must be something a little more than that the author has in mind. Which means the author is saying that when you consider the way the word is used, then let's look at today's usage and recognize that today's usage requires that we keep working as hard as possible to be able to create leisure for ourselves. So 1 would actually be the answer to this one. Fair enough? So 1 would be the author's position over here. Now let's move to 33. Here again we are talking about the author's position, right? So insects such as, Here again we are looking at author's position. So, insects such as bees and ants are often held up as the epitome of robotically mechanistic approach to animal nature. Scientists have long known that these creatures must possess a large behavioral repertoire in order to construct their elaborate homes, defend against intruders, and provision their young with food. Yet many still find it plausible to look at bees and ants as little more than reflex machines, lacking an internal representation of the world or an ability to foresee even the immediate future. In the absence of external stimuli or internal triggers such as hunger, it's believed that the insect's mind is dark and its brain is switched off. Insects are close to philosophical zombies, hypothetical beings that rely entirely on routines and reflexes without any awareness. So this person is telling us, basically this author is presenting two, let us say, views on bees and ants. One view being that they are very, let's say, they are very mechanistic. That means they actually have very defined ways to be able to run their lives. They have a large behavioral repertoire. They are very mechanistic because they have to construct their homes, they have to defend them, they have to provision their young. But that is because they are almost robotically mechanistic. That means because they are robotically mechanistic, people tend to think that they are just doing things on reflex, that they don't really have any sense, that they are just going about things like automatons. So insects and bees are held up as an epitome of a mechanistic approach, and they have long known that they actually, so that means many people know that they have to have large behavioral repertoire and many capabilities, but many people still consider it possible to look at them as just automatic machines. Okay, so he's giving you two viewpoints here, that of the scientists and that of people who view them as automatic machines. So one says, insects are perceived as little more than clever automata with pre-programmed behaviors that respond to scientific triggers. That is one view. As non-human animals are devoid of cognitive skills, it is not an exaggeration to refer to them as philosophical zombies with no inner life. That becomes a little more than that. As non-human animals are devoid of cognitive skills, this is a very large statement because it's not talking about insects specifically. Insects are by and large asocial beings who respond only to external stimuli. But what about the automatic behavior part? So that's not there in 3 either. 4. Although it has been scientifically proven that insects possess a large behavioral repertoire, they are widely perceived as mere reflex machines. Now I've got to look at either 1 or 4. Now let me look at 4 to see whether the although is actually justified. Now he says insects such as bees and ants are often held up as the epitome of automatic behavior. That's it. Robotically mechanistic approach is automatic behavior in animals. Then, while scientists have known that so over here he is giving you, scientists have long known that these creatures must possess a large behavior, yet many still find it plausible. That means the basic idea here is, so he is giving you the although here. It's almost like saying although they have known that creatures must possess, but that means although is only a secondary idea. Although is only a secondary idea. What's a primary idea? The primary idea is that there is a standard view or there is a widespread view that insects actually behave in very automatic ways. The although is only a secondary idea. Now if you want the author's position, then you have to give me the primary view, not the secondary. So A gives me both the secondary and the primary view. Although is a secondary view, they are widely perceived as reflex machines is the primary view. But the primary view is the author's position. So I've got to look at 1 because it gives me the primary view. That means insects are perceived as little more than clever automata with pre-programmed behaviors, things that come to them in reflex that respond to specific triggers. So 1 then is the author's position on this particular case, in this particular case, right? Now let's look at 34. We've got these are the reasoning type questions where you have a certain situation given to you and you have to work out the reasoning that goes on behind it. The black widow spider recently expanded its range from rocky outcrops scattered in desert landscapes to crevices in modern cities. That means it actually expanded its habitation. Ecologists predicted that their population in cities would likely to have lower genetic diversity than those living in rural areas because urban environments containing roads, building and other physical barriers can block dispersal, which means once they get to cities, ecologists felt that if they are building their habitation cities, then they are not going to interact with other subspecies as much. which means that genetic diversity would go down. However, recent studies show that city black widows have more within population genetic diversity than their rural counterparts. Which means within the population there is more genetic diversity, which means there is a lot more interaction that happens in the population within the cities than there is in the population that happens in the rural areas. Okay. So which of the following, if true, would explain the higher genetic diversity found? Which means this seems paradoxical, which means in cities the ecologists predicted that they are not going to move around too much, so their genetic diversity might be limited. But actually the genetic diversity is more. So how do you explain that? What would tell you that what would explain how the genetic diversity is more? Now A, black widow spiders do have few adaptations that make them overcome the physical barriers created by man. But when you say do have few adaptations, you say few and not a few, which means they don't have much to adapt. Then if they don't have much by way of adaptations, then that doesn't explain how they have genetic diversity. Okay. B, natural barriers found in deserts are far more formidable to black widow spiders than are barriers found in cities, which means in deserts there are actual limitations to how much the animal can move or how much the insect can move. Whereas in cities there is no such barrier. So if you're saying natural barriers are much greater than the city barriers, then the possibility of interaction between species and subspecies is much greater where there is less barrier than when there is more. So if there is more barrier in the desert than the city, then that explains why there is genetic diversity in the city. Right. So B is possible. C, urban population of black widow spiders are more mobile than that of other species of spiders. No, we are actually talking about the black widow herself. The whole thing is about the black widow spider. So we are not talking about other species of spiders. So I don't need to look at C. D, the number of reproductive cycles found in the lifespan of urban black widow spiders is the same as found in the lifespan of rural black widow. But we are not talking about reproductive cycle and the number of offspring that are produced. We are talking about genetic diversity. So D does not even relate to genetic diversity. So genetic diversity, see, the ecologist said that the lack of interaction between species and subspecies, between the subspecies of that larger species, would mean that there will be lower genetic diversity. But B tells us that natural barriers would actually be a greater impediment, and cities don't have so many barriers, which means socialization could actually happen in cities. So socialization is going to happen more in cities than is going to happen in deserts, and therefore the genetic diversity in cities can actually be higher. So B then becomes the answer to 34. Okay, and let's look at the last one here, which is 35. So you want to complete the paragraph. Robert Morris, a pioneer of minimalist structures, encouraged the viewer to focus on the artwork's relationship to its surroundings, the architecture of the gallery, and the viewer's own body rather than on the work itself. So he encouraged the viewer to focus on the relationship to its surroundings, to the architecture, and to the viewer's own body. He prioritized the effect an object would have on the viewer over its complexity of the work. So the effect of the viewing is, he thinks, that's much more important than the complexity of the work itself. However, his sculptures, though with simple shapes, cannot be simplistic from the view of aesthetic appreciation because, isn't it? Because he says that you cannot be, so basically what this person is saying is that he's not talking about the art being complex, he's talking about the effect the art has. And that is at least what he was trying to do with his paintings, right? But when you look at the sculptures, though these are simple, they cannot be simplistic from the view of aesthetic. That means it's not as if they just do that. Simplistic is you think that the effect is going to be minimal. You think that the effect is not going to have too much impact. But then that's not it. Because he says it cannot be simplistic because obviously the impact is not as simple as the shape. So obviously because the impact is not as simple as the shape. So what would tell me that? Robert Morris's works are representative examples of minimalist sculptures. That's a different statement. It's not a cause, it's not a reason. Because art appreciation requires formal training to appreciate complex art forms. No, this is about art appreciation and training. Because simplicity of shape does not necessarily equate with simplicity of experience. Yes, because even a simple shape can actually give you complex experience. Fine, so C actually works. Because not all simplistic works are considered artistic masterpieces. We are not talking about judging them as a masterpiece. We are talking about, don't think of simple shapes as simplistic only because a simple shape can actually give you a fairly complex experience. So simplicity of shape does not necessarily equate to the simplicity of experience. C would be your answer to 35. So we've finished this paper, and through it you've managed to, the idea was to help you understand that you need to build your skills with vocabulary, you need to build your skills with grammar, you need to build your skills with thought processes as well as reasoning to be able to properly recognize what you read. And since reading is what this whole exam is going to be about, your verbal ability in all these sub areas, we'll call vocabulary and grammar and thought process sub areas, let's say, and reasoning a sub area, all your ability in these sub areas would constitute your verbal ability and will help you actually read better. So what should you do? How should you go about building these things? How should you actually add these things to yourself? Well, I have a slide here that actually puts it all together. You might want to remember to use this to keep looking at it once in a while to recognize what it is that you should really be doing. So you should read. You should read a lot. And if you're going to be able to solve a para-jumble, or you're going to be able to recognize the meaning of words, or you're going to be able to recognize the meaning of sentences, your reading should really be accurate. And it should be an accurate or as close to accurate representation of what the writers represent. So do some general reading, not just RC. Do the RC, but do some general reading. At least 30-40 minutes a day. Read articles on the net or in magazines or in newspapers. Now use your reading to identify contextual relevance of vocabulary. It's important. Of sentence structure. That's important too, because vocabulary and sentence structure have meanings that they want to deliver, and therefore associations that can also be delivered. So use your reading to identify that relevance of vocabulary and sentence structure, of parastructure, of thought flow, of connections and reasoning. In other words, use a magnifying glass. Don't worry about speed, because when you start to understand, then you'll start to get faster anyway. So when you do careful reading and you start to understand what you're reading and you look at the contextual relevance of everything, then you will actually get faster in any case. Then you must think while you read. Why is the person using this word? What does it associate with? Why this tense? What does it indicate? Why this additional information in the form of a subordinate phrase or clause? What would it imply or lead to? Why this particular description? Does it imply exclusively or just one amongst others? Where is the author going with this in terms of reasoning? What are the possibilities that could progress from this in terms of thought flow? What does this refer to or connect to in an idea or thought earlier in this piece? That is thought flow again. And so on. When you ask yourself these questions, you actually make the connections, you recognize thought flow, you recognize the relevance of vocabulary and grammar. When you do this while reading, you'll actually reduce the rereading you have to do. When you do the thinking while you read, you will not have to go back so often or as often as you currently do to make sense of what you're dealing with. You might still go back once in a while, but not really often. Now you may think that reading like this slows you down, but only initially. Once you start recognizing the answers to your own questions, right? Once you actually start thinking like this over here, once you start recognizing the answers to your own questions, your interpretation will be better, the flow will be smoother, and your speed will be comfortable. So please remember that reading comprehension is clearly a test of verbal ability. Your ability with words, your ability with grammar, your ability with thought process, and your ability with reasoning would actually prompt your ability with reading comprehension. So since the exam is entirely about reading, then do pay attention to building verbal ability through your reading. That is what is going to actually help you in the final analysis. So read a lot, folks, and think while you read. That would give you the preparation that you need. Thank you.